In the dead of a Wyoming winter, at 30 below, a wild mustang knocked on a farmer's door. The storm screamed, but those 3 slow hoofbeats cut through the cold. Ethan Cole, alone in his barn, opened that door to find more than a freezing horse. He found a spark of something he'd lost. Fierce, fragile, and achingly human. The wind screamed across the Wyoming ridge like something alive, tearing through fences and howling against the sides of Ethan Cole's barn. Snow blew sideways, blinding white, swallowing every sound except the storm's rage. Inside, the world was smaller, just the crackle of a wood stove, the smell of pine smoke, and the faint hiss of snow sneaking through the cracks in the walls. Ethan sat by the fire, elbows on his knees, watching the flames bend and breathe. He had long ago learned how to live with silence. Tonight, though, the silence felt wrong. Too deep, too expectant. He lifted his coffee mug, the metal cold against his fingers when it came. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate, steady. Cock, cock, cock. Not wind, not wood shrinking in the cold. A rhythm with intention. He froze. His first thought was a tree limb hitting the door, but no branch could strike like that. Every muscle in him tightened, the old training returning without permission. The stillness of a man who once had to read danger in sound. He waited. The storm answered with another scream. Then, again, 3 hoofbeats against the door. Ethan stood, heart thudding beneath layers of wool. He grabbed his coat from the nail, pushed his arms through stiff sleeves, and crossed the room. The metal latch burned his fingers with cold. For a long moment, he didn't open it. He just listened, to the wind, to his pulse, to the strange certainty that whatever waited outside wasn't human. When he finally pulled the door open, the storm lunged in, filling the barn with whirling white. Through the curtain of snow, a shape stood, trembling, half buried in drift. A horse. Its coat was matted with ice, its mane clumped with frost. Breath burst from its nostrils in thick clouds, and snow clung to its lashes like salt. It didn't move forward. It only looked at him. Dark eyes glimmering with something between defiance and plea. Ethan's mind flicked through logic. Wild mustang, maybe injured, maybe dangerous. He should shut the door. Wild horses didn't knock. They bolted, bit, kicked. Yet this one had asked. The creature shifted, a weak tremor rippling along its flank. Snow hissed off its back, revealing scars beneath the gray coat. Old rope burns, the kind left by capture, not accident. Ethan's throat tightened. He'd seen those marks before, years ago at a livestock auction. Horses dragged from the red desert, frightened, sold for almost nothing. His father had once said, "A horse remembers hands that hurt and hands that heal." He looked at the animal now, shaking but proud, still holding its head high. The storm tore at both of them, stinging his face. He stepped aside, just enough to open a path inside. The horse didn't move. For a long breath, they just stared at each other. The man and the animal, 2 silhouettes in the stormlight. Then, slowly, it lifted one hoof and tapped the wooden threshold once more. Soft, measured, as if to ask, "May I?" Ethan gave a single nod. The mustang stepped in, Snow melted beneath its hooves, darkening the straw. Its body filled the small space with warmth and the smell of wet earth and survival. Ethan shut the door, the latch clinking into place, sealing out the storm. The sound of wind dulled to a distant moan. Inside, only the fire's light remained. He stood there, unsure what to do next. The horse turned its head toward the stove, nostrils flaring at the scent of heat, then lowered its muzzle to sniff the straw near his boots. Ethan reached for a bale of hay, cut the twine, and set a small pile near the wall. The horse didn't rush it. It waited until he stepped back before bending to eat. Something in that small act, its patience, its dignity, pressed against the frozen part of him. The fire popped. The horse chewed slowly, the rhythm steady, grounding. Ethan let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He spoke softly, voice rough from disuse. "Guess you found the right door, huh?" The horse flicked an ear, continued to eat. He sat again by the fire, boots stretched toward the warmth. Behind him, the steady sound of chewing filled the barn, calm against the storm's fury. Ethan glanced back once more. Snow still fell outside, but the cold no longer felt absolute. Something had entered his world, something that had crossed the line between wilderness and man, between survival and trust. He didn't know yet that this night, at 30 below, would rewrite everything he believed about loneliness, about shelter, about who saves whom. The wind rose again, but inside, the barn held steady. Two souls breathing the same air, listening to the same storm, bound by a fragile, wordless truce. Ethan leaned back, eyes on the fire. "Stay as long as you need," he murmured. "There's room here." The Mustang lifted its head, snow dripping from its mane, and met his gaze. For a heartbeat, the world outside disappeared, and the only thing that existed was warmth, trust, and the sound of 3 hoofbeats echoing in memory. Morning came slow to the Wyoming highlands, pale light pressing through cracks in the barn boards. The storm had quieted, leaving the world buried in silence and snow. Ethan Cole rubbed the frost from the small window and saw a white sheet of stillness. No tracks, no movement, just the ghostly calm that follows chaos. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of hay, iron, and damp wood. The horse stood where it had spent the night, near the far stall, its breath fogging softly in the cold. Ethan moved carefully, boots whispering against straw. He hadn't shared this barn with another living soul in years. He'd sold the last of his cattle 2 winters ago, after the divorce, after the bank notices. Since then, this place had been only his. A man, a stove, and too much quiet. Now the silence was different, heavier somehow, like it was listening. The horse turned as he approached, ears flicking, muscles taut beneath its gray coat. Its eyes followed him, not fearful, not trusting, just measuring. Ethan stopped a few steps away and studied it in the dim light. The creature was magnificent, even through exhaustion. Strong shoulders, deep chest, mane streaked with ash and frost. But the ribs showed. Hunger had carved it thin. He could feel the echo of its long miles through winter desert and snowfields. He spoke low, the way he once did to the horses his father kept. "You made it through the night," he said, his breath rising white. "That's something." The horse twitched one ear, then looked toward the empty stalls around them. The place had once been full of life, snorts, stamping hooves, the clatter of feed buckets. Ethan remembered the sound of his father's laughter echoing through these same rafters. Back then, he'd thought barns would always smell of hay and purpose, but time had hollowed the place. Dust lay where grain used to be, and spiderwebs glistened where tack once hung. He felt the sting of memory, sharp as frostbite. "Guess it's just you and me now," he murmured. He went to the storage room, found a small sack of grain he'd forgotten. The label was sun-faded, the paper soft with age. He poured some into an old pail and carried it back. The horse watched every move, nostrils flaring. When Ethan set the pail down, he didn't stay near it. He stepped back, giving the animal room. Minutes passed before it moved. Then one slow step, another, hooves sinking in the straw. It lowered its head, sniffed, and began to eat, cautiously, every muscle ready to bolt. Ethan felt a strange warmth rise in his chest, not from the fire, but from the sight of a wild thing finding rest, even if only for a moment. He sat on a stool by the stove, rubbing his hands together. The rhythm of chewing filled the barn, grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. His eyes drifted to the wall where his father's saddle still hung, cracked with age. Beneath it was a folded blanket, the last thing his mother had sewn before she passed. Both belonged to a life he'd stopped reaching for. Outside, the wind shifted. Ethan looked toward the door, listening. For the first time in years, he realized he wasn't dreading the next sound. He was waiting for it. He poured himself more coffee, the bitter steam filling the air, then looked over his shoulder. The horse had finished eating, now standing still, head lowered, half asleep. A faint calm spread across its body, the kind that only comes when a creature no longer feels hunted. Ethan leaned back against the post and let out a slow exhale. He thought about the road that had led him, here, 38 years of building, losing, starting again. He'd served in the local search and rescue for a while, spent nights pulling strangers from blizzards. Saving others was easy. Saving yourself never was. The horse shifted again, tail flicking, the quiet sound drawing his eyes. Its head turned toward the door, ears pricking at something unseen. Ethan followed its gaze, but there was nothing, only the hush of the frozen morning. Still, the animal kept watching, nostrils flaring slightly. "Easy," Ethan whispered. "It's just the wind." But a small part of him wondered if the Mustang heard something he couldn't, something in the vast whiteness outside. He pushed the thought aside and stood, stretching his back. He needed to check the generator and the well line before the next freeze. He glanced once more at the horse before stepping out. "You can stay here for now," he said. "Not much, but it's warm." The door creaked shut behind him, and cold air slapped his face. The world outside was blinding, sunlight glinting off snow so bright it hurt to look. He squinted toward the horizon, where the storm had left strange shapes of drift and shadow. It was beautiful in that dangerous way Wyoming always was, harsh, honest, unforgiving. By the time he circled back, his breath was smoke and his fingers numb. He opened the barn again, grateful for the warmth that spilled out. The horse lifted its head, watching him enter. Ethan smiled faintly. "Still here?" he said. "Good." He poured a little more grain, then sat again by the fire. The horse returned to its quiet eating. The rhythm was steady, comforting. He stared into the flames, the orange glow washing his face, and realized that for the first time in years, the barn didn't feel empty anymore. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Soft this time, not angry. Through the narrow window, the light flickered against the gray coat of the Mustang, making it shimmer like smoke. Ethan thought of the sound from the night before, the 3 hoofbeats, and knew he wouldn't forget them. They had broken the silence he'd built his life around. He took one last sip of coffee and whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe the storm didn't bring trouble. Maybe it brought you." The Mustang lifted its head, as if answering the thought, and the faint crackle of fire filled the space between them. Somewhere deep in the walls, the wind sighed through the old wood like a memory settling in. The next evening arrived under a bruised purple sky, the kind that promised more snow but held its breath before breaking. Ethan stood outside the barn, his breath rising in clouds, the sound of silence pressing down over the ridge. The Mustang, he'd started calling it Ash for the silver gray of its coat, was still inside, shifting gently on its hooves. The animal had eaten, drunk, even rested, but hadn't once tried to leave. Ethan leaned his shoulder against the barn wall, eyes tracing the horizon where the wind bent the snow like ghostly smoke. His father used to say Wyoming storms never ended. They just waited behind the next hill. And for a moment, Ethan felt that was true, not just of weather, but of life itself. He pushed the barn door open a few inches. Warm air rolled out, carrying the smell of hay and horse. Ash lifted its head, ears pricking. Ethan stepped inside slowly, keeping his movements quiet. He'd learned the rhythm of this creature already, its wary glances, the way its tail flicked when it felt uncertain. "Evening," he murmured, closing the door behind him. "Guess you decided to stay another day." The horse exhaled through its nostrils, a plume of mist in the dim light. It wasn't fear anymore, just awareness. That was something. Ethan crouched near the stove, added another log, and watched sparks leap like fireflies. The warmth crawled up through his jacket, easing the ache from his hands. He thought about calling the local ranger office, about reporting the stray animal as regulation required. But he didn't move. Something in him didn't want this found too soon. Maybe the world outside hadn't been kind to it. Maybe the world outside hadn't been kind to him either. He found himself talking as he worked, his voice rough from months of disuse. "You know, I used to have horses. My dad trained quarter horses for rodeos, said a man could read his own soul in a horse's eyes. I thought that was nonsense back then." He chuckled under his breath. Turns out he might have been right. Ash shifted closer. Not much, just a step. The sound of its movement filled the barn like soft thunder. Ethan froze, not wanting to scare it off. The horse stopped, lowered its head slightly, and began to nibble at the fresh hay he'd spread earlier. The rhythm was steady, hypnotic. Ethan sat down on an overturned bucket, his coffee mug warm in his hands. He studied the animal, the way its muscles rolled beneath the skin, the way its mane caught light. There was a calm to it, fragile, deliberate, that reminded him of the veterans he used to work with at the search and rescue outpost. People who had seen too much, but carried it quietly. For the first time, Ethan realized he didn't mind the company. Hours passed without much sound. He lost track of time watching the fire, letting the steady breathing of the horse fill the spaces between crackling wood. At one point, The wind howled so hard the shutters rattled, but neither of them flinched. The barn felt less like a shelter now, and more like an agreement between two survivors. When Ethan finally stood, his knees cracked in protest. He stretched, then reached for the latch on the main barn door. "I'm leaving this open tonight," he said softly. "You can go if you want. Storm's past. No reason to stay if you don't feel safe." Ash lifted its head, ears twitching, eyes bright. Snow drifted in through the small gap at the top of the door, catching in the horse's mane like glitter. For a long time, it just watched him. Then, with slow precision, it took one step toward the threshold, then stopped. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the wind sighing outside. Ethan's breath caught. This wasn't fear. It was choice. The horse could leave, but didn't. He gave a faint smile. "All right then. Have it your way." He left the door cracked open, the way his father used to leave it for the barn cats that came and went with the seasons. When he turned back, Ash had lowered its head again, chewing, unbothered by the open door or the drifting cold. Trust, Ethan realized, wasn't built by closing doors. It was built by leaving them open and waiting. Later that night, Ethan lay awake on the cot near the stove, listening to the steady breathing of the horse. The smell of hay, smoke, and life blended into something that felt unfamiliar. Comfort. He thought about the years that had vanished into quiet, about the nights he'd convinced himself solitude was peace, when it was really punishment. Ash shifted in the dark, the faint sound of its hoof scraping the ground. Ethan whispered into the quiet, unsure if he was talking to the horse or to himself. "Maybe we both just needed somewhere to rest for a while." The wind outside softened, brushing snow against the door like fingers on a drum. He closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the only heartbeat in the room. When dawn began to pale the windows, Ethan stirred and sat up. The door was still open, the snow piled just inside. But Ash was there too, standing watch, mane rippling with every draft of wind. Ethan smiled, a small private thing, and muttered, "Guess we made it through another night." Outside, the first rays of light touched the ridge, turning the snow gold. Inside, man and horse stood at the doorway between cold and warmth, each keeping the other company without needing a word. The day would bring new work, repairs, feed, calls, but for now, Ethan let himself stand there, breathing in the same air as this wild, uninvited guest. Somewhere deep inside, something long frozen began to thaw. He looked at the open door once more, then whispered, "Welcome home, Ash." The Mustang's ears flicked, and it gave a soft snort, like acknowledgement. The sound was quiet, but in the stillness of that morning, it felt like the beginning of everything new. By the fourth day, the air over the ridge had turned glass clear, the kind of brittle Wyoming cold that made every sound ring sharp. Sunlight spilled through the slats of the barn, painting thin bars of gold across the straw. Ethan woke to the soft creak of wood and the steady rhythm of hooves shifting weight. The horse, Ash, was still there. Somehow that surprised him every morning. He poured coffee into a tin cup and let the steam sting his face. Outside, the snow glittered, untouched except for a few prints leading to the water trough. He'd cleared the ice from it yesterday, breaking it open with a crowbar until the water shivered free. The horse had watched him the entire time, ears pricked, ready to flee but never running. There was a pattern forming between them now, a dance of nearness and retreat. Ethan stepped toward the stall, boots crunching softly on frozen hay. "Morning, partner," he said quietly. His voice sounded strange in the stillness. Rough, but kind. Ash flicked an ear toward him and blew a cloud of breath, neither welcoming nor warning, just aware. Ethan stopped a few yards away and waited. He'd learned already that forcing closeness only pushed it farther away. He scattered a little hay near the post, careful not to move too fast. Ash took its time, one slow step after another, until its muzzle brushed the straw. Ethan watched the ripple of muscles beneath its coat, power barely contained. He found himself smiling. It had been a long time since he'd smiled without meaning to. Later that morning, a truck engine broke the quiet. Ethan stepped out into the light, shielding his eyes. A ranger vehicle rolled up the snowy drive, tires crunching. From it stepped Nora Reyes, her brown braid dusted with frost, the green badge of the Bureau of Land Management catching sun on her jacket. "Ethan Cole," she greeted, pulling her gloves tighter. "Heard from a neighbor you might have company." "Word travels fast," he said, half grinning. "You looking for her?" Nora squinted toward the barn. "If she's a Mustang, technically she belongs to the range, not you. We've had reports of a small herd breaking fences up north. Could be one of them." "She's not breaking anything," Ethan replied, more defensive than he intended. "Just trying to stay alive." Nora's gaze softened. "I didn't say she wasn't welcome, but poachers have been working this valley. If they see a wild one staying close to people, they'll assume she's easy to catch. Keep an eye open, all right?" He nodded. She pulled a small jar from her coat pocket, ointment for frostbite, and handed it over. "If she lets you close enough, use this on the cracked spots around her shoulder. It stings less than iodine." Ethan took it, the metal warm from her body heat. "Thanks." "Don't thank me," Nora said. "Thank her for trusting you. Mustangs don't come to barns unless something out there scares them worse." When she left, her truck tracks cut twin scars in the snow, leading down toward the valley. Ethan stood watching until the sound faded, then turned back to the barn. Inside, the Mustang raised its head, as if sensing his hesitation. He approached a little closer this time, holding the jar loosely in his hand. He didn't reach out. He just sat down on a low stool across from her, close enough to feel her breath stir the air. "They think you're running from something," he murmured. "Can't say I blame you. Seems like everyone's running from something these days." Ash shifted her weight, the faint jingle of the halter ring she still wore, a broken piece of rope, echoing in the quiet. Ethan wanted to cut it off, but knew better than to rush. Trust wasn't an order to be given. It was a question that had to be asked over and over until the answer came on its own. Through the afternoon, he worked outside repairing fence posts splintered by the storm. The sky stayed an endless blue, so bright it hurt. From time to time, he caught glimpses of Ash standing in the doorway, watching him. When he stopped to drink water, the horse would lower its head and step back, as if pretending indifference. The game between them was silent, but clear. Curiosity tethered to caution. That evening, the temperature plunged again. Ethan dragged a small bale of hay closer to the fire stove and unrolled his sleeping bag beside it. Ash stayed near the far wall, shifting occasionally, the sound of hooves grounding the night. He spoke softly across the distance. "You don't owe me anything. You can go tomorrow if you want." The horse snorted, steam rising like smoke, and returned to its quiet rhythm of breathing. Ethan watched the movement of its chest, slow and steady, until his own breath fell into the same cadence. There was peace in that rhythm, fragile but real. Hours later, a faint sound snapped him awake, the creak of the door hinge. Moonlight poured in through a small crack, silver and cold. Ash was standing by the opening, head turned toward the valley. Ethan sat up, but didn't move closer. The horse stood for a long time, ears tuned to some distant sound only it could hear. Then, to his surprise, it stepped back inside and nudged the door shut with its shoulder. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Smart choice," he whispered. When morning came, the frost on the windows glittered like stars. He rose stiffly, poured coffee, and noticed hoof prints leading to the trough again. But no new tracks beyond the fence. Ash was still there, still watching him with those deep, unreadable eyes. He smiled and held up the jar of ointment. "Maybe today's the day we shorten that distance," he said. The horse blinked once, tail flicking. Maybe it understood. Maybe not. Either way, it didn't turn away. The line between them, between wild and human, hadn't vanished, but it had shifted a fraction closer. Outside, the wind carried the smell of snow from the north, whispering of another storm to come. Inside, for now, warmth lingered, and a fragile truce held. Ethan sipped his coffee, eyes on the Mustang, and felt the weight of solitude ease just a little more. The storm had been gone for 3 days, but the air still held its memory, sharp, metallic, waiting. Ethan woke before sunrise, when the world was nothing but blue shadow and frost. The coffee pot hissed on the stove as he slipped on his coat and stepped outside. The snow groaned beneath his boots. Every sound felt too loud against the quiet morning. He rounded the barn, breath turning to smoke, and saw it immediately. Tracks. Not hooves, not the delicate print of a deer. Tires. 2 deep, narrow trails carved into the crusted snow, curving toward the fence line before disappearing into the trees. His gut tightened. He crouched, tracing one gloved finger through the frozen ridge of rubber tread. They were fresh. Too fresh. Behind him, Ash snorted, the sound low and uneasy. She stood in the doorway, muscles tense, watching the trees the same way he was. Her breath came quick, her ears angled back. It wasn't the cold that bothered her. It was memory. Ethan rose slowly. "You heard them too, didn't you?" he said quietly. The horse pawed once at the ground, then stilled. He followed the tire marks to where the fence sagged slightly. One of the older posts split from the last storm. The tracks ended just past it. Someone had stopped here, long enough to look through the fence toward his barn. He could almost see them. 2 men in a truck, the engine idling, watching. A ripple of anger passed through him, brief, but hot. He'd seen enough of that kind of cruelty growing up. Men who thought life was theirs to claim if it had 4 legs and no voice. His father used to ride out against poachers the same way he'd ride into wildfires, without hesitation. Ethan had tried to be that kind of man once. Then the world had changed, and somewhere along the way, he'd stopped believing his actions mattered. But looking at those tracks, something old stirred in him. He walked back to the barn, the crunch of his boots rhythmic and sure. Ash was waiting, shifting from hoof to hoof. The morning light touched her coat, turning the gray to silver. She looked at him as if expecting direction, and for a strange moment Ethan felt the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders again. Not for land, not for debt, but for this creature that had trusted him enough to stay. Inside, he shut the door and leaned against it, listening to the wind scrape across the roof. "Looks like we've got company out there," he said. "Let's keep that between us." He moved through the day quietly, mending fences where the boards had cracked, checking the generator fuel, chopping kindling. Each sound, each simple act, seemed to anchor the silence in place. Ash followed him sometimes to the threshold, her presence steady as a shadow. She still wouldn't let him near enough to touch, but she no longer shied away when he passed. That was progress enough. By late afternoon, the light thinned, cold pressing in again. Ethan paused to take a breath, hands gripping the wooden handle of his axe. Beyond the tree line, the sky bruised to a heavy gray. Another storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the air seemed to tighten. He looked back toward the barn and saw Ash standing perfectly still, staring into the distance. Her nostrils flared, her whole body leaned slightly forward. Ethan turned, following her gaze. For a second he saw nothing but white. Then, faintly, movement. A figure near the far ridge, blurred by snow. There one heartbeat, and gone the next. The axe handle slipped in his grip. "Not the wind," he muttered. Ash gave a sharp, restless snort. Her hooves struck the floor once, twice, as if echoing his thought. He stood there until the sky dimmed, until the figure disappeared entirely, swallowed by the storm's edge. When he finally returned to the barn, he could still feel eyes on his back. Inside, he stoked the fire higher, the crackle filling the space between them. "You're not the only one with ghosts out here," he said to the Mustang. She didn't move, only lowered her head to drink, but her ears twitched toward him, listening. As darkness fell, snow began to drift again, whispering against the windows. Ethan sat by the stove, rifle across his knees. He hadn't held it in years, not since the search and rescue days. It felt heavy, foreign. But something about those tracks wouldn't let him rest. He reached into the cupboard, found a small tin of oil, and began to clean the gun by habit. The motion calmed him. The slide of cloth, the click of metal. It wasn't fear that drove him. It was readiness, a quiet understanding that the world didn't always leave a man alone just because he wanted to be. Ash shifted near the stall, her hooves thudding softly. He looked up, meeting her eyes. There was a steadiness in them, a kind of alert partnership he couldn't explain. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I won't let them near you." Outside, the storm picked up again, snow swirling past the cracks in the barn, like ghosts trying to get in. Ethan leaned back against the wall, the fire's glow painting half his face in amber, the other half in shadow. He thought of Nora's warning. Poachers have been around. Keep an eye open. And of how easily he'd dismissed it. Now, staring into the dark beyond his window, he wasn't sure what scared him more, the men who might come back, or the way this horse had made him start to care again. Hours passed. The wind moaned, the fire burned low, and still he didn't sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the tire marks in the snow, the broken post, and the faint shape at the ridge. Just before dawn, he heard the softest sound, a hoof tapping against the wood, gentle and deliberate, like the night he first met her. He turned. Ash was watching him, eyes half reflecting the firelight. She wasn't afraid. She was waiting. Ethan let out a breath, the tension leaving his body with it. "All right," he whispered. "We'll keep watch together." The wind outside wailed once more, but inside, The two of them stood silent in the warmth, guardians of each other's small corner of the storm. The morning broke gray and windless, that rare silence between storms when even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Ethan hadn't slept more than an hour, his mind still circling the tire tracks carved into the snow like scars. He poured coffee, the bitter heat grounding him, and looked toward the stall where Ash stood. She was still, her coat dulled with frost near the shoulders, her breath rising in slow, steady clouds. "Morning," he said softly, the word more habit than greeting. She turned her head, one ear flicking toward him. Something inside him eased at the sound of her quiet breath, a rhythm steadier than his own heartbeat. He set the mug aside and reached for the jar of ointment Nora had given him. The metal was cold in his hand, the label smudged from where his gloves had rubbed it. He stared at it for a long moment before speaking again. "Let's try something today. No rush." Ethan approached slowly, steps measured, deliberate. Every inch between them felt earned. The Mustang's eyes tracked him, dark and sharp, but she didn't move. When he reached the halfway mark, he stopped, crouching low to seem smaller. The smell of her, dust, cold, wild grass, wrapped around him. He opened the jar, the faint scent of menthol mixing with the barn air. "This'll sting a bit," he murmured, not because she'd understand, but because saying it out loud steadied his nerves. Ash shifted, her hoof scraping the straw. He froze. "It's all right," he whispered. "I won't hurt you." He stretched out his hand, trembling slightly from the cold, or maybe from something deeper. The ointment glistened in his palm. The horse tensed, muscles coiling under her skin. Ethan kept his arm still, letting her decide. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Ash stepped forward, slow and cautious, lowering her head just enough for her muzzle to brush his sleeve. He could feel the heat of her breath through the fabric. That close, he could see the small scars along her neck. Old rope burns, healed, but never forgotten. "Someone did this to you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't they?" She flinched as though she understood. Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to say more, to promise her safety, but promises were heavy things, and he wasn't sure he could carry another one. He shifted, closing the gap another inch until his fingers almost touched her shoulder. The moment stretched thin, fragile. He could see her pulse beating beneath the skin. His hand moved closer, slow, steady, until his fingertips brushed the rough edge of the scar. The reaction was instant. Ash jerked back, nostrils flaring, hooves slamming against the floor. The jar clattered from his hand, rolling through the straw. Ethan stumbled but didn't shout, didn't chase. He just raised both hands and whispered, "It's okay. Easy now." The horse retreated to the far corner, trembling, chest heaving. Her eyes were wide, the whites flashing in the dim light. Ethan stayed on his knees, the sting of hay scratching through his jeans. He wanted to move, to fix it. But all he could do was breathe. The space between them felt cavernous again. Minutes passed. The wind outside rose, brushing snow from the roof in soft sighs. The storm wasn't gone. It had only circled back, quieter this time. Creeping. Ash's breathing slowed. She turned her head slightly, her gaze finding him. He could see it, the conflict in her stance, torn between fear and recognition. He stayed still, hands open on his knees. "You're all right," he said softly. "I pushed too far. That's on me." His voice cracked a little on the last words. He hadn't used that tone in years, the kind that came from apology, not command. He waited. Finally, the Mustang exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, and lowered her head. Not forgiveness, but something close to it. Ethan gathered the jar, wiped the spilled ointment with an old rag, and placed it back on the shelf. His hands shook, not from cold this time, but from the echo of what he'd felt when she'd let him near. That moment, brief as it was, had felt like holding a piece of trust too fragile to last. He leaned against the post, eyes on her. "Guess we both have places that hurt to touch." Ash flicked her tail, the sound soft as a sigh. The rest of the day passed quietly. Ethan fixed the lantern hook near the stall, sharpened tools, anything to keep his hands busy. Each time he glanced over, Ash was watching, her ears tilted forward, curiosity replacing fear. When he stepped outside at dusk, she followed him to the door, stopping just short of the threshold. The sun had dipped behind the ridge, painting the snow in bruised violet. The wind had changed again. Warmer. Restless. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, staring at the horizon where the sky burned faintly pink. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, not looking at her. "You could, you know. The gate's still open." She didn't move. He smiled faintly. "Yeah, me neither." That night, the storm finally broke. Rain, not snow this time. Sheets of sleet tapping the tin roof like impatient fingers. The sound filled the barn, washing away the quiet. Ethan lay on his cot, eyes open to the flicker of lightning outside. Through the noise, he heard something. A soft shuffle near his side. He turned his head. Ash had moved closer, standing just a few feet from the cot, her head lowered. The scent of rain and horse filled the air. He didn't speak, didn't reach out. He just watched her, heart steadying with the rhythm of her breathing. For the first time, she didn't keep the distance. When dawn came, the rain had frozen into glass on every surface. The barn steamed faintly in the morning light. Ethan rose stiffly, his breath fogging the air. Ash stood near him, calm, her coat shining wet and clean. He reached for the jar again, held it up for her to see. "We'll try again someday," he said quietly. "When you're ready." This time, she didn't step back. Outside, sunlight cracked, through the clouds, scattering across the valley. Ethan watched it spill over the snow and thought, maybe storms don't destroy. Maybe they just clear the air so you can see what's been waiting underneath. The snow had begun to melt around the edges of the fences, thin rivulets of water carving quiet paths through the drifts. The worst of winter had passed, yet the air still carried that clean, metallic scent that only mountains kept after a storm. Ethan Cole stood by the barn door, one hand resting on the latch, the other clutching a mug gone cold. Behind him, the low sound of breathing filled the space. Ash, half dozing in her stall, her flank rising and falling in an easy rhythm. Days had slipped into a strange kind of peace. They had found a routine. He worked the land, mended fences, split wood. She followed, grazing near the yard or standing by the gate when the wind grew strong. It was the rhythm of coexistence. No words, no claims, just presence. And yet, beneath that quiet balance, something else stirred. Trust had grown roots, but so had fear. His, not hers. He feared what came after. Ethan turned toward the stall. "You look better," he said softly. "Healthier." Ash's ears flicked, her tail swishing lazily. She had filled out again, muscles smoothing where bone once showed. He watched her shift her weight, the movement strong and graceful. She wasn't the same creature that had arrived broken by the storm. She was reclaiming something wild, and he knew that meant she could leave at any time. The thought pressed on him all morning. It stayed while he loaded hay onto the sled, while he repaired a loose hinge on the barn gate. Freedom was what she deserved. But every time he pictured the barn empty, the silence that would follow felt like something sharp lodged in his chest. He remembered his father once saying, "A man who lives alone starts talking to his ghosts." Ethan had been doing that for years before Ash came. Only now, the ghosts seemed quieter. By noon, the sky dimmed again. The wind came down from the ridge carrying the smell of pine resin and something darker. Ash. Smoke. Ethan's brow furrowed. He looked toward the east slope and saw a thin ribbon of gray rising between the trees. Someone had built a fire. Too close. Too deliberate. He left the sled where it was and walked toward the fence. Ash followed him halfway, her hooves soft in the slush. He raised his binoculars, scanning the line of pines. Through the shifting heat of the smoke, he caught sight of movement. 2 men, a truck, and something glinting near the tailgate. Metal. Chains. Poachers. The word tasted bitter. He lowered the binoculars, pulse hammering. Nora's warning echoed in his mind. If they see a Mustang that stays near people, they'll come for it first. He turned toward the barn. Ash had frozen, her head high, nostrils wide, catching the scent of danger before he could speak. She gave a low, uneasy rumble from deep in her chest. Ethan moved fast. He gathered what supplies he could. Water, rope, a flare gun. "We'll keep low," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if it was to her or himself. "No one's taking you." He pushed the barn door half shut, enough to hide her silhouette, but not enough to block her escape. That door, always the same symbol, never quite closed, now became their lifeline. Hours dragged. The wind shifted, carrying the faint crack of an engine closer. Ethan crouched near the window, the rifle laid across his knees but untouched. He had no plan for violence. He only meant to protect. Through the narrow slit, he saw shadows moving among the trees. One of the men laughed, a sound too loud for the quiet world. Then the truck door slammed, and the forest fell silent again. Ethan's fingers tightened on the wood stock. The seconds stretched, each one edged with the tension of waiting. Ash shifted behind him, restless, the sound of her hoof scraping the floor. He turned his head slightly, whispering, "Easy, girl. Stay quiet." Outside, a crow screamed. Then, nothing. Minutes turned to hours before the noise faded completely. When the light finally began to die, Ethan stepped outside, boots sinking into slush. The smell of smoke lingered, but the fire was gone. Only tire tracks cut through the mud where the truck had been. They'd left. For now. Ash came to the doorway, head low, mane tangled with straw. Her eyes met his. There was something ancient in that look, relief mixed with understanding. He reached for her slowly, stopping halfway between them. "They're gone," he said, voice soft. "You're safe." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, as if testing fate, she stepped forward until her muzzle brushed his shoulder. The touch was light, fleeting, but it stopped his breath. He could feel the warmth of her through his jacket, a heartbeat echoing faint against his chest. He didn't reach to hold her. He just stood there, still as stone, afraid to break the spell. The Mustang lifted her head, eyes catching the thin orange light of the setting sun. It flared in her mane like fire, wild and alive. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You're something else," he murmured. That night, he left the door half open again, though the cold bit harder than usual. Some part of him needed that opening, needed to prove to both of them that freedom wasn't a threat. Rain began to fall around midnight, soft at first, then heavier, drumming on the roof. Ethan lay awake on his cot, listening. Ash moved near the door, her silhouette framed by moonlight. The half-open space let in slivers of silver air that shimmered between them. He whispered into the dark, "If you want to go, I won't stop you." The rain filled the silence, washing his words away. He waited for the sound of retreating hooves. It never came. When morning broke, she was still there, standing by the door, the light soft on her back. Ethan rose, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and met her gaze. Something quiet passed between them. Acceptance, perhaps, or a promise neither could speak. He reached for the latch, meaning to close the door just to keep the chill out. But he stopped halfway. He left it half open, the same way it had been all night. Because some doors, he realized, were meant to stay that way. Not as a barrier, not as an invitation, but as a reminder that trust can live in the space between. He turned toward her and said softly, "Maybe that's what home is, huh? A door that never shuts." Ash flicked her tail once, the sound like a quiet answer. Outside, the clouds thinned, revealing streaks of pale blue sky. Inside, the warmth held steady, neither trapped nor free, but balanced, like them. The next storm rolled in without warning, thick clouds bruising the afternoon sky before Ethan could finish the last stretch of fence. The air carried that low hum that came before a blizzard, the kind of sound you felt in your teeth. He dropped his hammer, eyes lifting toward the ridge where the light had already gone white. The snow started softly, lazy flakes drifting down, then thickened fast, swallowing the horizon. He hurried back toward the barn, his scarf whipping in the wind. By the time he reached the door, snow stung his face like shards of glass. Ash stood in the entry, ears forward, her body a solid shape against the whirling white. She seemed larger than life in that moment. Wild, fierce, alive. But her eyes told a different story. Worry. She pawed once at the ground, impatient, as if urging him inside. "I'm coming," he called, though the wind tore the words away. He shoved the door shut behind him, sealing them in the warm dark. The fire in the stove still burned, small but steady. He threw in more wood, breath clouding in the cold air. The storm roared outside, shaking the roof beams, rattling the latch. Snow forced its way through the cracks, hissing against the hot metal of the stove. Ash snorted, backing a few steps, then stopped. Her ears flicked toward the door again. Warning. Ethan froze. Beneath the howl of the wind, he heard it. A faint metallic clang, like something striking the fence. Once. Then again. He grabbed his flashlight, sweeping the beam through a narrow gap in the boards. The storm made everything ghost-like, but there, faint and dark, a figure moved near the gate. The outline of a truck sat idling just beyond the tree line, its lights dimmed, engine muffled by the wind. He couldn't see faces, but he didn't need to. The poachers had come back. Ash let out a low, vibrating growl, a sound he hadn't known horses could make. It cut through the storm, sharp and warning. Ethan's throat went dry. He reached for the rifle propped against the wall, checked the chamber. He didn't want to use it, hadn't fired at anything living since the army. But tonight wasn't about pride. It was about survival. The latch clanked again, louder this time. Ash stomped once, muscles taut, ready to bolt if she had to. Ethan stepped to her side, voice steady though his heart was racing. "Easy, girl. Stay with me." A shadow passed by the window, then another. The sound of boots crunching in snow came closer. The men were checking for signs of life. He could almost hear their muffled voices under the wind. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't confront them in the open. The storm would swallow his voice and sight. But if he stayed silent, they might push harder. He needed something that said this place isn't worth the trouble. He turned the light out, leaving only the flicker of the fire. In the dark, he moved to the door and waited. When the latch shook a third time, he slammed his palm hard against the wood and shouted, "Private property! Get off my land!" The sound carried, low and rough, ripped from his lungs with more anger than he knew he still had. There was a pause, long enough for him to hear his own breath. Then footsteps retreating, fast. A door slammed, and the truck engine growled before fading into the distance. He stood there for a long moment, hand on the latch, heart pounding against his ribs. When the sound of the truck finally disappeared, he turned back toward Ash. She hadn't moved. Her eyes gleamed in the firelight, steady, unshaken. "Guess we scared them off," he murmured. The storm howled harder, battering the walls as if testing their strength. Ethan dropped to his knees beside the stove, feeding it more wood until flames licked high again. He rubbed his hands, the heat biting his skin. Ash took a step closer, then another. She lowered her head until her muzzle brushed his sleeve, the gesture light, but sure. He didn't flinch this time. He looked up at her, seeing frost still clinging to the tips of her mane, melting into tiny rivers down her neck. "You kept me from walking out there," he said softly. "You knew." Her breath was warm against his cheek. She exhaled once, a sound almost like a sigh, then stood between him and the door, as if claiming her place. The storm raged through the night, relentless. Every gust shook the barn, but inside, a fragile calm held. Ethan sat on the floor, back to the wall, watching the fire cast shadows across the boards. Ash stayed near the doorway, her body blocking the draft, her head occasionally turning toward him as if to make sure he hadn't moved. Hours passed. He dozed lightly, waking each time the wind screamed too loud. Sometime after midnight, the storm reached its peak. The roof groaned under the weight of snow, and Ethan shot upright, instinct kicking in. He scanned the rafters for weak spots, heart thudding. The sound came again. A heavy thud. Not the roof. The door. He grabbed the flashlight and crossed the barn. When he cracked the door open, snow burst in, blinding him. The wind nearly tore it from his grip. He leaned into it, light cutting through the swirling white, and froze. The fence had collapsed. 2 posts snapped clean from the ground, snow piled against the opening. If the men came back, there'd be nothing to keep them out. Before he could move, Ash stepped forward, pressing her shoulder against his chest. Not panicked, insistent. She pushed him back, her body between him and the storm. Ethan blinked, realization dawning. "You're not trying to get out, are you?" She snorted, shaking her mane, eyes fierce. She wasn't leaving, she was keeping him in. He let out a breath that broke into a laugh, half disbelief, half awe. All right, you win." He closed the door again, securing it with the iron bar. Then he turned and leaned his forehead against the wood, the sound of the wind on the other side fading to a low hum. He stayed like that for a while, the warmth from the stove brushing his back, the steady breathing of the Mustang beside him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "Maybe I'm not the one giving shelter after all." Ash stood still, her flank brushing his arm. Together they listened as the storm raged, and then, gradually, began to fade. By dawn, the snow had stopped. The light that filtered through the cracks was soft and blue. Ethan opened the door again, careful this time. The world outside shimmered. White, endless, reborn. The broken fence would have to wait. Ash stepped beside him, her coat gleaming in the pale morning. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she lifted her head high, mane catching the first hint of sun, and gave a short, strong snort that echoed down the valley. Ethan smiled. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We made it." He leaned against the frame, eyes closing as the light touched his face. Behind him, the fire crackled, the barn smelled of smoke and life, and for the first time in years, the warmth he felt had nothing to do with the stove. The storm left behind a silence so deep, it felt like the world was holding its breath. The valley lay buried under a smooth, unbroken blanket of snow, every fence post capped in white. The air was sharp and clean. Even sound seemed to move slower. Ethan stepped outside the barn, boots sinking halfway with each step. The sun hadn't yet cleared the ridge, but the sky glowed a soft gold, a fragile promise after nights of chaos. Ash stood at the barn door watching him. Her coat gleamed, silver beneath the pale light, her breath spilling out in small, even clouds. She looked strong again, alive in a way that made his chest tighten. "Morning, girl," he said quietly. "You did good." She blinked, the slow kind of blink that meant she wasn't afraid. He thought about how far they'd come, from that first frozen night to now, standing in the thaw of a new day. He'd built fences his whole life, but this was the first time he wanted one to stay broken. Nora's truck appeared just before noon, its tires crunching over the frozen road. She waved as she climbed out, the cold reddening her cheeks. "Heard that last storm nearly took the roof off half the valley," she said. "You all right out here?" Ethan nodded. "Roof held. Fence didn't." Her eyes moved past him, landing on the horse. "And her?" "She's fine." Nora studied the Mustang for a long moment, her ranger's gaze both cautious and admiring. "She's beautiful," she said finally. "You know, she could be tagged officially. Would make her easier to track if she ever runs back into the wild." Ethan frowned. "But good?" "Nothing harmful," Nora explained, reaching into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small, reflective collar, thin leather with a strip of dull silver that would shine at night. "It's for her safety. Hunters stay clear of marked stock. No number, no chip. Just recognition." Ethan turned the collar over in his hands. The leather was soft, worn smooth. The metal tag caught the light, flashing briefly like a heartbeat. "No chain?" "No chain," Nora said. "Just a name, if you want to give her one." He hesitated, feeling the weight of the object. Names were dangerous things. They made everything harder to let go. But as he looked at Ash, standing proud and calm against the white, he realized she already had a name. She'd chosen it herself, in the color of her coat, the ashes of survival. He nodded slowly. All right, we'll try. Nora smiled. She trusts you now. Let her see you first. Move slow. Ethan stepped toward the Mustang, the collar loose in his fingers. Ash didn't back away. The wind stirred her mane across her eyes, and she watched him with quiet certainty. He raised the collar, letting her sniff it. It's nothing bad, he said. Just a little light, for the dark. She flicked an ear, exhaled softly, and lowered her head. Ethan slipped the collar around her neck, the leather cool against her skin. It rested perfectly, neither tight nor loose. The silver tag caught the sunlight again, scattering it like dust. There, he whispered. Now they'll know you belong nowhere. And that's how it should be. Nora leaned on the fence, watching the exchange. You did good, Cole, she said. Some folks spend years trying to earn that kind of trust. Ethan gave a half smile. Didn't earn it. She gave it. Nora's expression softened, then turned serious. Word is the same truck's been seen near the South Pass. Keep your eyes open. Men like that don't always quit after one try. He nodded, jaw tightening. If they come back, they'll find I'm not the same man I was. After she left, Ethan walked back into the barn, the sound of her truck fading into the distance. Ash followed, the collar glinting faintly each time she moved. He unlatched the back door, letting the crisp air in. The sky had turned an impossible shade of blue, the kind that made the snow look almost silver. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her wander out to the yard. She moved carefully at first, then began to trot, her hooves kicking up powder. The sun collar shimmered with every step. It wasn't a mark of ownership. It was a reflection of light. Freedom made visible. When she finally came to a stop near the broken fence, she turned her head to look back at him. The distance between them wasn't wide, but it held everything they'd learned. The hesitation, the trust, the fear, the forgiveness. He walked closer, stopping just short of reaching her. You know, he said quietly, I used to think fences were what kept things safe, but maybe they just kept things from ever finding their way back. The wind carried his words away, but she seemed to understand. She stepped closer, brushing her shoulder against his hand. The collar gleamed as she moved, the silver strip catching the last of the light. Ethan smiled, fingers tracing the air where the leather met her fur. You're free. Ash. Always were. That night, the air turned still again, moonlight draping the valley in silver. Ethan sat by the stove, carving a small piece of wood with his pocket knife. When he finished, he held it up to the light. It was a crude figure of a horse, mane swept back like it was running against the wind. He set it on the shelf beside his father's saddle. For a moment, he just looked at it, then turned toward the barn. Through the open door, he could see Ash standing outside, her collar glinting faintly under the moon. She was facing the ridge, where the wilderness began. He felt a flicker of fear, that she might go. But then she lowered her head, pawed the ground once, and turned back toward him. The moonlight spilled over both of them, bridging the distance. Good night, Ash, he whispered. Her ears twitched, and she gave a soft whinny in reply, low, melodic, and sure. Ethan leaned back against the post, the smell of wood smoke and cold air filling the space between breaths. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the fire spread through his chest. For the first time in years, He didn't feel like a man waiting for something to end. He felt like a man beginning again. Outside, the collar shimmered, bright enough to catch the stars, faint enough not to hold her down. By the time March came, the world had started to breathe again. The valley changed slowly, like someone waking from a long dream. Snow pulled back from the fence posts, revealing patches of brown earth. The river that had slept under ice began to whisper. For the first time in months, Ethan could smell wet soil instead of frost. He was fixing a hinge on the barn door when he heard hoofbeats, not Ash's, lighter, uncertain. He turned, wiping his hands on his coat. Down the ridge, a small figure stumbled through the last crust of snow. A young colt, ribs thin, steps uneven. Its coat was patchy, winter rough, and its tail flicked in panic. Ethan froze, scanning the tree line for movement. No herd. No sound. The colt was alone. Ash's head lifted immediately. She snorted, her ears sharp, then began to move toward the open gate. Ethan felt it in his gut before she even reached it. She knew that kind of fear. She'd worn it once. "Easy," he murmured, though she wasn't listening to him. The Mustang slipped through the broken fence, hooves light, neck low in a gesture of peace. The colt hesitated, stumbled back, then stood trembling as Ash approached. The sight stopped Ethan cold, her slow steps, the gentleness in her body. She reached the colt and nudged it lightly with her muzzle, a sound escaping her that wasn't quite a whinny, more like a hum, low and comforting. The colt shivered once, then pressed its nose into her shoulder. Ethan swallowed hard. There was something holy in that quiet moment. Two creatures who shouldn't have survived, finding each other in a world still thawing. He didn't move closer. He just watched as Ash guided the colt back through the open fence. She didn't push or drag. It followed her willingly. When they reached the yard, Ethan stepped aside, heart pounding. The colt blinked up at him, wary but not afraid, then stumbled toward the warmth of the barn. Ash turned, meeting his gaze as if asking permission. He nodded. "Bring it in." Inside, the air was still heavy with winter, smoke, hay, and faint traces of last night's fire. Ethan spread fresh straw in the corner while Ash stood guard over the colt. Its legs trembled with exhaustion. He fetched a bucket of warm water and a few flakes of hay, setting them close but not too close. "Here," he said softly. "Take what you need." The colt sniffed, uncertain, then took a bite. Ethan leaned back against a beam, watching them. Ash nudged the colt again, protective. He thought of the old words his father used to say when a stray animal wandered in. A soul knows where it's safe, even when it doesn't know why. Hours passed in that hush. The fire crackled. The colt lay down. The wind outside softened. The sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves became a rhythm, steady and clean. Ethan found himself smiling without realizing it. That evening, Nora's truck appeared again at the top of the hill. She waved as she stepped out, the slush sucking at her boots. "Heard from the feed store you've got another visitor," she called. "News travels too fast around here," he said, half laughing. When she entered the barn, she stopped short. "Well, I'll be damned," she whispered. "Where'd it come from?" "Don't know," Ethan replied, but she found it, led it right through the fence. Nora crouched, studying the colt's legs, the raw marks around its ankles where rope had once bitten in. Poor thing. Someone dumped it or lost it. She looked up at Ash, admiration soft in her voice. "And she brought it here." "Guess she decided I needed more company," Ethan said, the corner of his mouth lifting. Nora smiled, but her eyes carried something else, something deeper. "You've both been saving each other out here, haven't you?" Ethan looked away, embarrassed by the truth in her words. "Maybe just keeping busy." When Nora left, evening had begun to fall. The barn glowed in shades of amber, firelight licking the wood. Ash lay beside the colt now, her head lowered, breathing slow. Ethan sat on the stool, sipping coffee gone lukewarm. "You're something else," he murmured to her. "You bring strays, rebuild fences, scare off trouble. If I didn't know better, I'd think you were running this place." Ash's tail flicked, the faintest sign of amusement, or maybe coincidence. Later, as he stepped outside, the air smelled of pine and wet earth. Above the ridge, stars began to emerge one by one, clear and sharp. He leaned against the fence, watching the breath of the land, steam rising from the snow, water running beneath. Everything was changing, alive again. Behind him, the colt let out a small whinny. Ash answered softly, a low sound of reassurance. Ethan turned to look. She stood in the doorway, light framing her like the outline of a dream. The colt pressed close to her side, safe in the circle of her shadow. He realized then that she hadn't just come here for warmth or food. She'd come to start again, and somehow she'd given him the same chance. The night air bit through his jacket, but he didn't feel the cold. He walked back toward the barn and stood in the doorway beside her. "Seems like we've both got mouths to feed now," he said. Ash turned her head, her eye catching his reflection in the dark. It glowed faintly, calm and knowing. He smiled. "All right then. Guess we keep building." They stood there a while longer, watching the stars shimmer over the valley. The last of the snow began to fall from the roof, sliding down in a soft rush, melting the icicles that had clung for months. By morning, puddles would form in the yard, and the first green blades of spring would push through the earth. But for now, it was enough. Just the warmth of breath, the crackle of fire, and the quiet certainty that they had all survived something meant to break them. Ethan reached up, touched the edge of the door, and smiled. "You can stay," he whispered, "for as long as you want." Ash exhaled, and the colt stirred closer to her side. Outside, the valley sighed as the snow finally began to let go. By April, the mountains were still wearing snow at their crowns, but down in the valley, the thaw had taken hold. Water ran beneath every fence, carrying the scent of wet pine and old earth. Ethan's ranch, once a white desert, was now a patchwork of green and gold, soft light spilling through the trees each morning like forgiveness. He had fallen into a rhythm again, not the kind born of habit, but of belonging. Every day started with the creak of the barn door, the smell of hay, the sound of hooves shifting softly against the floor. Ash greeted him with a snort that had become her version of good morning, while the colt, growing stronger each week, pranced around her legs in clumsy joy. Ethan couldn't help but smile. "You've got your hands full, huh?" he said. Ash flicked her tail, watching the colt chase shadows. The collar around her neck had dulled with time, the silver strip no longer new but still catching light when the sun rose just right. It had become part of her now, less a marker, more a memory. Every so often he'd catch himself standing at the doorway, simply watching them. The sound of their breathing, the rhythm of movement. It filled the spaces in his life that used to echo. But peace, he'd learned, is a fragile thing. That evening, as the sun began to slip behind the ridge, Nora stopped by again. Her truck carried dust now instead of snow. She brought feed and news. "You've heard about the poachers?" she asked as she unloaded. Ethan shook his head. "They caught one group near Red Creek, but there's still a second truck they haven't found. Same tire marks you described last time. Be careful." He nodded slowly, jaw tight. "I'm always careful." "I know," Nora said, studying his face. "But there's careful, and then there's ready." He didn't answer. She sighed, dusting her hands. "Still, this place suits you. You look different, Ethan. Lighter." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I finally stopped fighting the wind." She tilted her head, her voice softening. "Or maybe you just found something worth staying for." He looked past her to the barn, where Ash stood half in shadow, the Colt pressed against her side. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe I did." After she left, the silence returned. Not empty, but full of meaning. The kind of silence that hums with life. Ethan poured a cup of coffee and sat on the porch. The air smelled of sage and melted snow, and the wind carried the faint sound of running water from the creek. He thought of his father then, the man who had built this place with rough hands and stubborn hope. The saddle still hung where it always had, the leather worn smooth by time. Ethan had spent years avoiding it, unable to face what it symbolized. A legacy he thought he'd failed. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he rose and went to it. The leather creaked as he lifted it from the hook. Dust swirled in the golden light, catching in the air like slow snow. He ran his fingers along the stitching, each thread holding a story. "You'd like her, old man," he said softly. "She's got your kind of pride." He set the saddle down carefully and turned toward Ash. She was watching him again, still and steady. The Colt lay curled at her feet, half asleep, breathing deep and safe. "Guess I should thank you," he said. "You didn't just survive. You taught me how." She didn't move, but the flick of her ear, the slow exhale, was answer enough. Later that night, the temperature dropped, a thin veil of frost brushing over the grass. Ethan built up the fire in the barn, not for warmth, but for comfort. The soft glow danced across the walls, touching the wooden beams, the tools, the old photograph of his parents he'd pinned to the post months ago. Ash stood near the Colt, her eyes reflecting the light. The small one stirred, let out a tiny whinny, then went back to sleep. Ethan crouched beside them, resting his arms on his knees. "You know," he said, voice low, "I used to think this place was a punishment. All that quiet. It was like being buried alive. But now," he paused, looking at them both, "now it feels like a prayer I didn't know I was saying." Ash turned her head, brushing her muzzle lightly against his sleeve. The gesture was so gentle it nearly undid him. He stayed still, eyes stinging in the firelight. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, a whisper rather than a roar. The kind of wind that carried peace instead of warning. For the first time in years, Ethan felt small, but safe, like part of the same rhythm that guided everything living around him. He rose and went to the open door. The moon was climbing, pale and full, its light spilling silver over the fields. Ash followed him halfway, her collar glinting faintly. The Colt remained asleep, wrapped in straw and warmth. Ethan leaned against the frame, staring out across the valley. You ever wonder, he said softly, why some of us get second chances? Ash stepped beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. He smiled at that, at the idea that maybe, just maybe, she understood. The two of them stood together, watching the light spread across the snow-melt river. It glittered like glass, alive and restless. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, lonely, but not lost. Ethan tipped his head back, breathing in the cold air. For a long time, I thought quiet meant empty, he whispered. Turns out it just meant waiting. Ash flicked her tail once, slow, then rested her weight evenly, content. The silence that followed was perfect. Not hollow, not heavy, just right. When dawn came, the sky turned rose and gold. Ethan opened the door wide, letting the morning spill in. Ash stepped out first, leading the colt into the yard. The light hit their coats, turning them to molten silver. Ethan smiled. Go on, he said. It's your world again. The Mustang looked back at him once, eyes deep and calm, then lowered her head to graze. The colt followed clumsily, legs too long for his body. The sound of their hooves, soft against the thawing ground, was the sound of thanks. Ethan stayed by the door, the warmth of the fire at his back, the cool air on his face. He didn't call out or move closer. He didn't need to. Somewhere between the storm and this sunrise, everything that was broken had found a way to mend. The first real warmth of spring arrived quietly, without thunder or warning. Just a slow awakening of color. Green brushed across the hills, wildflowers pushed through soil still damp from melted snow, and the river below the ridge carried a steady hum that felt almost like music. The ranch that once looked abandoned now breathed again. Ethan Cole stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the valley stretch awake under the soft gold of morning. His hands were rough and scarred, his face weathered by years of cold and silence, yet there was something new in the way he looked at the world. Something lighter. In the field, Ash grazed near the fence, the colt darting around her in bursts of joy, a blur of legs and sunlight. Every so often she would lift her head and watch Ethan, her ears twitching at the faint sound of his voice when he spoke to them from the porch. That quiet acknowledgement was enough. They didn't need more. Ethan took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine, smoke, and damp grass, the scent of a place finally forgiven. It had been months since the night of the last storm, months since the fear and loneliness that once ruled this land had begun to fade. Now there was work to do, fences to rebuild, land to clear, a life to tend, but he no longer felt buried under the weight of it. The work wasn't punishment anymore. It was purpose. He walked toward the barn, the morning light brushing across his shoulders. The door swung open easily, its hinges smooth from care. Inside, tools hung in order. The stove still carried the faint warmth of last night's fire, and the carved wooden horse he'd made sat on the shelf beside his father's saddle. Dust had settled on it, but it belonged there, part of the story now. He reached up, touched the carving, and smiled. "We did all right, old man," he whispered. The sound of hooves behind him made him turn. Ash had followed, the colt trotting at her side. She stepped halfway into the barn, lowering her head in quiet greeting. Her collar caught the light again, its silver strip faded now, but still glimmering faintly, like a memory refusing to dull completely. Ethan chuckled. You always know when I start talking to ghosts. The Mustang exhaled softly, the sound steady and calm. He poured grain into a shallow pan, setting it near the door. You've got a choice, he said. There's open range out there. Grass, rivers, sky without end. Or you can stay here, free to come and go. Ash didn't move right away. She turned her head toward the valley, where the mountains rose like walls of light. For a long time, Ethan watched her decide. Then she stepped forward. Not out, not away, but closer, brushing past him as she moved deeper into the barn. Her flank touched his shoulder, just enough to leave warmth behind. Ethan laughed quietly. All right then, guess we're both staying a while longer. The colt let out a small squeal, leaping through a patch of sunlight. Ash turned to nudge it gently back toward the doorway. Ethan watched, smiling, the corners of his eyes creasing. It struck him how much had changed, without ever being planned. A winter's mistake had become a reason to begin again. As the day stretched, Ethan went about his chores. He fixed a broken trough, cleared debris from the last storm, checked the generator. The Mustang and the colt followed him like shadows, disappearing now and then into the meadow, but always returning by dusk. When evening came, the valley turned the color of amber honey. The sun dipped low, the sky alive with brush strokes of pink and gold. Ethan sat on the porch steps, tired but content. He could hear the soft snort of horses near the barn, the steady rhythm of life that had become his new heartbeat. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for the silence to end. The silence was the music now, the pulse of the land, the whisper of grass, the breath of animals who trusted him. He thought of the night she first arrived, covered in frost, eyes wild with fear, and how he'd hesitated to open the door. He thought of the storms they'd endured, the danger, the waiting, the long nights where even breathing felt heavy. And then he looked out at the field, where Ash now stood calm and whole, her shadow long in the fading light. Some storms break us, he said softly, echoing the words that had once haunted him. Others bring us home. The colt nickered, chasing fireflies that had begun to rise from the grass. Ash's head lifted, her gaze following the sky as stars began to appear. Ethan leaned back against the porch post, sipping the last of his coffee, its warmth gone, but its taste grounding. The sound of night wrapped around him like an old coat, familiar, worn, but comforting. He looked once more toward the barn, where the light of the lantern glowed faintly through the slats. You're home now, he murmured. All of you. Ash turned, catching his eye across the distance, and gave a soft, low whinny. The sound was brief, but full of meaning. Ethan smiled, nodding once in return. He didn't need to say anything more. The quiet said enough. When the moon rose high, the ranch shimmered silver again, not with frost this time, but with peace. The old wounds, theirs and his, had healed into something stronger than they'd ever been before. He closed his eyes and listened. Wind through the grass, water running in the creek, the rustle of hooves shifting near the barn. Each sound was life answering life. And for the first time since he could remember, Ethan Cole didn't dream of leaving this place. He dreamed of staying. Some storms come to break us. Others bring us home. If this story touched your heart, tell me, would you have opened that door? Comment 0 if you believe kindness can still change a life. Comment 1 if you believe even the wildest hearts deserve a second chance. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you again that hope can arrive when you least expect it.